Elena had grown used to being invisible. Most folks who stayed at the Elkridge Inn barely noticed the slight, soft-spoken maid who swept the floors and carried water before sunrise. Travelers came and went, cattlemen with whiskey on their breath, stagecoach passengers wrapped in dust, soldiers always looking for trouble, but none ever looked long enough to remember her face. She moved like a shadow, quiet and careful, sometimes wondering if she'd been born merely to fill the space between footsteps. That night, the end of a long, punishing day, the desert wind carried a strange chill. Elena finished her chores well after the inn had settled. Lanterns were dimmed, laughter faded, and only the quiet creak of the signboard swung outside. She stepped into the open yard, hugging her shawl around her shoulders. It was then she heard something shifting inside the old barn near the back fence. The place had stood empty for months, good only for storing broken plows and scrap wood. No horse had been kept there in years. At first she hesitated. Strange noises after dark in a town like Elkridge were often signs of trouble: raccoons, coyotes, or worse, drunks who'd lost their way. But the sound came again, lower this time, almost like a muffled groan. Elena drew a breath and pushed the barn door open an inch. The dim moonlight filtered through cracks in the old boards, dust swirling in thin beams. At first, she saw nothing. Then her eyes caught the shape of a man slumped behind a pile of hay bales. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a ranch hand. The moment she saw the long dark hair, the painted bead in one braid, the copper-toned skin, her breath hitched. Apache. A lone Apache warrior. Inside the town limits. Her mind raced. Every child in Elkridge grew up hearing stories about Apache raids. Men boasted of killing one as if it proved something. If anyone in town found this stranger wounded, cornered, alone, they'd shoot him before asking a single question. She should have run. She should have screamed. Instead, she found herself stepping closer. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Blood soaked his side, dark against the torn leather of his clothing. His eyes were closed, but his jaw was set in the kind of stubbornness she recognized. She'd seen animals cling to life with that same fierce will. Elena swallowed hard. "Can you hear me?" she whispered. His eyelids flickered. For a heartbeat, piercing dark eyes met hers. They were disoriented, fierce, and full of a pain that made her knees weaken. He didn't speak, not a single word, but his hand twitched toward his wound. It wasn't a plea exactly, but it wasn't a threat either. Elena backed away, trembling. She knew what helping him meant. If anyone caught her aiding an Apache, she'd be shunned, fired, maybe worse. But leaving him there alone, bleeding, felt like leaving a man to die in the cold. And Elena knew too well what it felt like to be left behind. She slipped out of the barn and hurried to the inn's kitchen. Her hands shook as she filled a small tin cup with water and wrapped a leftover biscuit in cloth. She told herself she would only check on him once, only enough to satisfy her conscience. But when she returned, he was still watching the door, eyes alert despite the pain. He didn't move when she crouched beside him, didn't pull away when she held the cup to his lips. Hunger and thirst softened the hard lines of his expression. He drank, slowly, cautiously. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Elena realized she would return again, tomorrow night, and the Apache, though he said nothing, seemed to know it too. The next night, Elena told herself she wouldn't go. She moved through her chores with mechanical focus, scrubbing floors, folding linen, avoiding the mirrored window in the pantry because she knew what she'd see in her own eyes. Curiosity, fear, and something else she dared not name. Every few minutes she caught herself glancing toward the back door, toward the path that led to the barn. Each time she forced her gaze away. Helping him once was risky. Helping him twice was lunacy. But as the evening deepened, The skies over Elkridge took on a bruised purple, and the wind carried the far-off howl of coyotes. A heaviness sat on her chest. What if he died during the day? What if she'd abandoned him to bleed out on cold dirt? By the time the inn quieted and the last lamp was turned down, Elena was already slipping outside, her shawl pulled tight. A small satchel of bread and boiled potatoes hidden under her arm. The barn loomed against the moonlight dark, silent, watchful. She paused at the door, hand trembling. Just check on him, she told herself. Then leave. When she eased inside, the smell of earth and old hay filled the air. She expected to find him slumped and weak like the night before. She did not expect him to be standing. Dakota, though she still didn't know his name, was upright, bracing himself against a post. Even injured, he looked like a creature cut from the wilderness itself, tall, broad-shouldered, eyes sharp as obsidian. But his stance wavered, pain tightening the muscles of his jaw. The moment he heard her step, he turned, and for the first time she saw his hand clutching a knife. Elena froze. He wasn't threatening her, not exactly. The blade was held downward, not raised. It was a warning, a silent question. Are you friend or foe? Her heart hammered, but she forced herself to lift the satchel. I brought food, she whispered. His eyes flicked to it, then to her face. Slowly, very slowly, he lowered the knife. He didn't thank her. She doubted he knew enough English for that, but his posture eased, the tension melting from his shoulders. She stepped closer and offered the satchel. He took it from her hands, careful not to touch her skin. As he ate, Elena gathered scattered straw into a rough seat. His breathing was still strained. The wound in his side bled through his bandage. You need medicine, she murmured. If that gets worse, you won't last. He lifted his gaze. For a moment, the intensity in his eyes pinned her in place. It was as if he were measuring her soul, testing her intentions, reading the truth beneath her fear. And then he spoke. Just one word. Why? She blinked. His voice was low, hoarse, accented, each sound shaped with effort. Why you help? The question cut straight through her. Elena swallowed hard. Because no one deserves to die alone in the dark. His expression shifted, something like understanding, or maybe recognition, flickered behind his eyes. He said nothing more, but he reached for the torn leather strap tied around his wrist and loosened it. He pressed it into her palm, a gesture of trust, of truce. She didn't know what Apache customs meant, but she knew a vow when she saw one. Elena tied the strap carefully back onto his wrist. I'll bring clean water tomorrow, she promised. And more food. He nodded once. A silent agreement. As she slipped out into the night. She could feel his gaze following her, steady, unblinking. Burning like a brand against her spine, she knew, with a mixture of dread and strange exhilaration, that she would return again, and this time, it wasn't duty that would lead her back, it was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The wind had a sharper bite that night, cutting through the thin shawl Elena wrapped around her shoulders. Each step toward the barn made her chest tighten, not from the cold, but from the anticipation, the helpless excitement she tried so hard to deny. Her heart thumped as if warning her of something she didn't yet understand. She reached the back fence and paused, listening. The barn sat silent, dark, almost mournful under the moonlight. For a moment, she considered turning back. After all, she had warned herself countless times. One wrong move, one whisper from a neighbor, and both of them would be lost forever. But then a faint groan reached her ears. She froze, hand gripping the strap of the satchel full of food. It was him, Dakota, the injured Apache. And something told her that leaving him now would be a crime. She could never forgive herself for. The door creaked as she entered. The smell of hay mixed with a faint tang of dried blood. She found him slumped against a post, pain etched in every line of his face. His eyes flicked to her, sharp, wary, yet softened by relief. "More food," she whispered. Kneeling beside him, he didn't speak. He just nodded, allowing her to place the satchel at his side. Elena's fingers trembled as she tore strips of cloth from her shawl to bind his wound more tightly. She was careful, almost reverent, afraid that the slightest wrong move might cause him unbearable pain. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional hiss of the wind through the barn cracks. At some point, her hand brushed his accidental, fleeting. His eyes locked onto hers, dark, smoldering, questioning. She couldn't pull away. Neither of them could. Suddenly, the sound of hoofbeats broke the spell. Elena's heart lurched. Shadows moved outside, men from the inn, rifles in hand, searching for signs of trouble. Her mind raced. If they found Dakota, he would be dead within moments. And if they saw her helping him, she would suffer too. Without thinking, she pressed herself against him, covering him with her body to hide him from view. His breath was ragged, but he didn't push her away. Instead, he seemed to understand that she had chosen him over her own safety. The riders' voices grew louder, thundering against the barn walls. Elena whispered, barely audible, "Don't move. Stay quiet." She felt his chest rise and fall against hers, the steady rhythm reassuring her that he was alive, that she had made the right choice. They waited like that, hearts pounding, bodies pressed together in the suffocating darkness. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind felt like it might betray them. Time stretched, measured only by the pounding of her pulse and the shallow, cautious breaths of the man beneath her. When the voices finally faded, Elena dared to look at him. Dakota's eyes were fixed on hers, an intensity that left her breathless. There was no need for words. In that moment, a silent bond was forged, one born not just of fear, but of trust, of a shared understanding that they were alone in the world, and had chosen to protect each other. Elena finally allowed herself to rest, leaning back against the post, her hand lingering on his arm. She realized she was no longer simply a maid, no longer just an observer. She had chosen him, and he, in his own quiet way, had accepted her choice. For the first time, Elena understood the weight of what she had done. She had risked everything, her reputation, her life, for a man she barely knew. And yet, as she glanced into his unwavering, shadowed eyes, she knew she would do it again without hesitation. That night, she didn't just give him aid. She gave him her courage, her loyalty, and perhaps, unknowingly, the first pieces of her heart. And somewhere deep inside, she sensed that the bond they had formed in that dark barn would be the beginning of something neither of them could escape. Days that followed were the kind that tested both courage and restraint. Elena moved through the inn as though she carried a secret wound, one that ached and pulsed with a dangerous heat. Her hands worked mechanically, her eyes often darting toward the barn, toward the place where Dakota waited, recovering from the injuries she had tended in the dark. Though she tried to maintain her usual quiet, something had shifted. Every time she glanced toward the back fence, every time she imagined the dark figure waiting in the shadows, a spark of longing flared inside her chest. She told herself it was foolish. He was a stranger, a man who belonged to a world she had never truly known. And yet, the memory of his eyes, sharp, dark, and unflinchingly honest, haunted her. Dakota, for his part, made no overt gestures of gratitude. His culture demanded restraint, and the lines of his face were rarely softened by words. But Elena noticed the small things, the way he would glance up when she entered the barn, the slight nod of acknowledgement, the way he allowed her to touch the bandage on his side without flinching. Each gesture, subtle and unspoken, spoke volumes she could not ignore. Rumors began to spread through Elkridge, as whispers do in small towns where curiosity is both pastime and punishment. Travelers noticed the flickering light in the barn long after the inn had gone quiet. Some claimed to see a shadowy figure moving inside. Others swore they heard laughter soft, intimate, and distinctly human. The innkeeper, a woman who prided herself on knowing everyone's business, gave Elena pointed looks. "You've been spending a lot of time in the barn," the innkeeper said one afternoon, leaning against the doorway with arms crossed. "Make sure it's nothing that'll get you into trouble." Elena's throat tightened, and she forced a smile. "I'm only checking on the horses, ma'am," she said. The lie felt heavy in her mouth, but no other explanation could be given. Not without betrayal, not without exposing Dakota to a town that would never forgive him for being who he was. And so, the nights grew longer, and Elena found herself returning to the barn again and again. Each visit brought a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Fear of discovery, fear of what her heart was beginning to crave. Exhilaration at being near him, at feeling a connection deeper than anything she had known. One evening, as the moon rose high, Elena dared to speak aloud, her voice trembling. I don't know why I keep coming back." Dakota's eyes met hers, unwavering. Though he said nothing, the tilt of his head, the slight softening of his gaze, answered her question in a way words could not. She understood then that he felt it too, a magnetic pull. Quiet yet undeniable. Elena knew, deep down, that their closeness could not remain a secret forever. Townsfolk were already talking. Any slip, any misstep, could turn the tide against them. But in that quiet, moonlit barn, she also realized something more dangerous. She did not care. She did not care if the town discovered them. She did not care if the world outside judged her. All that mattered was the man before her, the lone Apache who had survived against odds, who had trusted her, who had come to mean more than she could bear to admit. And so, with every cautious touch, every whispered exchange, and every stolen moment of connection, a forbidden love began to bloom in the shadows. It was delicate, fragile, and entirely perilous, yet it was also undeniable. Elena left the barn that night with her heart pounding, the weight of their shared secret pressing against her chest. She knew the world outside was dangerous, unforgiving, and quick to condemn. But in her mind, a single thought remained. Whatever came, she would return. Because she could not stay away from him. The night air was thick with tension, carrying a chill that seemed sharper than usual. Elena's shawl did little to shield her from it as she hurried across the yard, satchel of food clutched tightly to her chest. Her heart pounded, but it wasn't just the cold or the long walk, it was a premonition she could not shake. Something had changed in the air, a subtle shift that whispered of danger. As she neared the barn, she froze. Moonlight glinted off metal horses' bits and rifles. Voices, harsh and commanding, cut through the stillness. Elena's stomach dropped. Riders, men from Elkridge. And they were looking for him. For her first instinct was to run back to the inn and hide, to pretend she had seen nothing. But the thought of leaving him defenseless, alone, wounded, vulnerable was unbearable. Every instinct, every ounce of courage, drew her forward. The barn door groaned as she eased it open. Inside, Dakota shifted at the sound of the horses, the scraping of hooves, the muted voices outside. His hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt, muscles tensing, but his eyes, dark, alert, and unwavering, met hers. "Elena," he whispered, his voice low, hoarse, almost a growl. "Stay close." She nodded, though fear gripped her like iron. Together they crouched behind hay bales, shadows among shadows. The rider's boots crunched across the dirt, rifles swinging with threatening precision. Elena could hear one mutter. "They said he was hiding here. Let's smoke him out." Her pulse thundered in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to save herself. But she stayed, pressing her body closer to his, covering him with the warmth of her own presence. She realized then that this wasn't just protection, it was a declaration. By staying, she was telling him, without words, that she would not abandon him. Dakota's hand brushed hers briefly, almost imperceptibly. It was enough. Enough to remind her that he understood, that he trusted her, and that he too would risk everything. The riders' voices grew louder. One slammed a boot against the barn wall, searching, demanding, threatening. Elena's fingers tightened around the rough wood of the hay bale. She felt the tension in Dakota's shoulders, the silent readiness for violence. But he did not move. Not yet. He waited for her signal. She leaned forward slightly, whispering, "Wait for me." On my mark. For what felt like hours, they remained hidden, breath held, hearts pounding. Outside, the men prowled like wolves, unaware that the prey they sought was protected by the smallest of shields, a maid trembling but resolute. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the riders' voices faded. Footsteps retreated, leaving only the echo of their threat behind. Elena exhaled a shaky breath, relief mingling with fear. Dakota turned to her, his eyes softening just slightly, acknowledging the bravery she had shown. No words were needed. The bond between them had deepened in that night of peril, no longer just a fragile connection of necessity and secrecy, but a shared commitment forged in danger, Elena realized, with a mixture of awe and terror that she had crossed a line. She had chosen him over herself, over safety, over reason. And she knew, deep down, that there would be no turning back. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the horizon, Elena and Dakota sat together in the barn, bodies still close, hearts still racing. The threat had passed for now, but the world outside was relentless. And both of them knew that each stolen moment was precious, for tomorrow could bring new hunters, new dangers, and new choices they would have to face together. That night, Elena understood a truth that would define every night after. Some bonds are stronger than fear, and some choices, once made, cannot be undone. Dawn crept slowly over Elkridge, painting the sky in pale pinks and golds. The town stirred with the usual hum of life chickens calling from coops, carts rattling along dirt streets, and the faint murmur of travelers preparing for the day. But inside the Elkridge Inn, the morning brought a revelation that would ripple through every whispered conversation for weeks to come. Elena's bed was empty, neatly made as though she had never slept there at all. Her belongings were gone. The innkeeper's eyes widened as she discovered the missing shawls and tin cups. "Where in the world?" she muttered, stepping into the hall, suspicion knitting her brows. And then she found the letter, folded carefully, placed atop the pillow, the handwriting elegant and precise, though unfamiliar. The words were few, but they carried the weight of everything Elena had kept hidden. "I am gone. Fear is a chain I will not let bind me or her. Forgive me, strangers of this town, but some hearts cannot be caged. T." Whispers erupted through Elkridge almost immediately. She ran off with the stranger. One woman exclaimed, clutching her bonnet in disbelief, "It must be that Apache they've been talking about." Another shook her head, scandalized. "A maid gone? This is unheard of." Outside, the yard was littered with evidence of their flight. Footprints leading toward the hills beyond the town, faint traces of a horse's hooves, and the remnants of hastily packed supplies. Those who knew the back paths recognized the signs immediately. Elena had guided him. She had chosen him, and in doing so, had vanished from the town that had long overlooked her. Dakota's presence in the mountains was no longer secret. Every shadow along the trail hinted at danger. Every ridge offered both refuge and the possibility of discovery. Yet the morning carried a strange, electric sense of liberation. For Elena, leaving the inn behind, leaving the cautious life of a maid, meant stepping into the unknown, into a world where she had power over her own fate for the first time. Her thoughts drifted to the barn, the nights they had spent in the quiet darkness, the whispered words, the shared warmth, the moments of fear and trust that had bound them together. Each memory was a thread in the tapestry of their fledgling connection, thread she would carry with her now, tightly wound around her heart. She had no illusions about what awaited her. The world beyond Elkridge was wild, unforgiving, and full of peril. Settlers with guns, bounty hunters, and the prejudices of the townspeople would not easily forgive her choices. Yet, standing at the edge of the familiar world, she felt a strength she had never known, the kind that comes from deciding, truly and irrevocably, whom to follow and whom to love. Dakota had risked everything for her, not just his safety, but the fragile trust of his own people. And in return, she had chosen to trust him completely. That bond, forged in the shadows of fear and danger, had now become a declaration written across the rising sun. Elena tucked the letter safely in her satchel, a talisman of courage and love. She would not look back. Whatever judgments awaited in Elkridge, whatever questions or scorn, it mattered little. For the first time in her life, she was no longer invisible. She was no longer a maid bound by the walls of the inn or the expectations of the town. She was chosen. And she had chosen in return. Beyond the hills, a figure waited wounded, silent, and vigilant. Dakota watched the horizon, sensing her approach, knowing that their lives had just shifted irreversibly. Together they would face whatever came next, for in that quiet golden morning everything had indeed changed. The maid who had once vanished into the shadows had stepped fully into the wild, uncharted world of love, danger, and freedom. And there was no turning back. The climb into the mountains was grueling, the trail narrow and jagged, but Elena barely noticed the aches in her legs or the sting of the morning sun on her skin. Her heart and mind were fully occupied with Dakota, who moved beside her with effortless strength. Every glance he cast her way was careful, almost protective, as if the weight of her trust was something he held sacred. At last, they reached the hidden canyon, a place that seemed untouched by the world below. High cliffs wrapped around a small, flowing stream and dense pines provided shade and shelter. Here, Dakota's people had built dwellings that blended seamlessly with the landscape structures of wood and stone. Smoke curling from cooking fires, the soft murmur of life that seemed both alien and profoundly comforting to Elena. The first moments were overwhelming. She had grown up in Elkridge, where life was rigid, small, and confined. Here, she could hear the wind in the trees, the rush of water over rocks, the distant call of birds. And yet, the presence of others, all watching her silently from the shadows, reminded her that she was not merely a guest in their world. Dakota led her to a modest lodge, carved partially into the cliffside. The walls were lined with furs, blankets, and simple wooden furnishings. A small fire burned in the hearth, casting warmth across the space. Elena's fingers traced the edge of a carved table, and she realized she was seeing a life completely foreign to her, yet one that beckoned with the promise of belonging. His tribe regarded her cautiously. Some eyes were curious, others wary. Elena felt the weight of their scrutiny. They did not speak her language, and she did not yet understand theirs, but their silent judgment was unmistakable. Dakota stood in front of her, a shield against any unspoken threat, and offered a subtle gesture of reassurance, a hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Elena realized then that she was being introduced not just to a home, but to a culture, a way of life that demanded respect, patience, and courage. Here, she would not be invisible. She would have to learn, adapt, and prove herself worthy of the trust Dakota had given her. As the day wore on, she helped prepare food, fetching water from the stream and learning the rhythms of the canyon. Dakota observed her quietly, his presence a steady anchor. He did not speak much, but the small nods, the subtle gestures, the moments when he met her gaze spoke volumes. He trusted her, and she understood that trust was rare, precious, and not to be taken lightly. By evening, Elena began to feel a fragile sense of peace. The fear that had clung to her in Elkridge was replaced by something new possibility. In the shadows of the canyon, she could allow herself small freedoms, small moments of laughter and curiosity. And yet, she was aware that this life was not without danger. Hunters from the town might follow, or worse, the prejudices of strangers could ripple into her sanctuary. Still, she felt a profound truth settling in her chest. Dakota had not brought her here as a captive. He had brought her here to be safe, to be valued, and perhaps, in time, to be loved. That night, as she lay wrapped in blankets, listening to the murmur of the stream and the occasional owl call, Elena allowed herself to imagine a life she had never thought possible. A life where fear was tempered by trust, danger was balanced by love, and where the small, quiet maid from Elkridge could become someone strong, someone courageous, someone who belonged. And in the flickering firelight, she realized she had already begun to belong not just to this place, but to the man who had saved her, and to the bond that now tied their fates together forever. The canyon had grown quiet under the fading light of late afternoon. Elena and Dakota moved through the forested slopes, gathering firewood and checking traps. Birds called overhead, and the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. For a moment, Elena allowed herself to believe they were safe, that the world of Elkridge and its harsh judgments was far behind them. But safety, she soon realized, was an illusion. The first warning came in the form of distant hoofbeats, muffled yet unmistakable. Her chest tightened and a cold shiver ran down her spine. She froze, instinctively moving closer to Dakota. His eyes darkened, sharp as obsidian, and he lowered his head, listening. "They've come," he murmured in English, his voice low and steady. Elena's heart pounded. The hunters from Elkridge had tracked them, determined to reclaim what they thought they owned, her, and the man they considered an enemy simply for being Apache. The thought sent a surge of fear through her, but also a fierce, protective resolve. She would not allow them to take him. Not now, not ever. Dakota led her to a concealed path behind a dense thicket, the forest growing darker and the shadows longer. Every step was careful, deliberate. Elena could see the tension in his movements, the way his hands gripped the knife at his belt, ready to defend. Her own hands shook, but she forced herself to remain calm. Fear was a luxury they could not afford. As the hoofbeats grew closer, voices carrying orders floated on the wind. Elena strained to hear, catching fragments. "There she is. We'll get him this time. Can't let him escape again." The hunters were confident, dangerous, and relentless. Dakota finally stopped near a rocky outcrop, motioning for her to stay low. From their vantage point, they could see the men moving through the lower canyon, rifles ready. Elena's breath came in shallow bursts. Every instinct screamed to flee, but she stayed, drawn to Dakota's calm, commanding presence. "She won't leave me," he said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for Elena to hear. "And I will not let them touch her." Elena felt a warmth rise in her chest at his words, a mixture of fear and awe. This man, so strong and silent, had staked everything on her survival, just as she had staked everything on him. The bond between them, forged in whispered nights and stolen moments, had become unbreakable. The hunters began to fan out, approaching the cliffs, unaware of the hidden paths above. Dakota gestured for Elena to climb higher, leading her to a narrow ledge that wound along the rock face. She followed, hard hammering, muscles straining with every step. At the top, they paused, breathless, hidden from sight, from their vantage point. Elena saw the hunters below, searching, shouting, cursing. She understood now the stakes, not just her safety, but the fragile trust between worlds, the precarious balance of life and death in the canyon. She tightened her shawl around her shoulders and met Dakota's gaze. No words were needed. Together, they would face them. Together, they would stand. Elena knew she was no longer just a helpless girl from Elkridge. She had become a partner, a shield, and a voice for the man she had chosen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the canyon, Elena whispered a vow to herself. No matter the danger, no matter the odds, she would fight for him. And he would fight for her. Their enemies might come, but they would not break them, not while they had each other. And in that quiet, tense moment, surrounded by the looming cliffs and the threat of rifles below, Elena felt something she had never felt before. Courage, unshakable and fierce. Born of love and survival. The morning sun slanted over the canyon, painting the cliffs in warm gold, but Elena barely noticed the beauty. Her mind was focused entirely on what had to be done. The hunters from Elkridge were still prowling the lower trails, relentless and arrogant. But she understood something they could never comprehend. She no longer belonged to the town, to anyone's judgment or expectation. Her allegiance had been claimed long ago. She stood at the edge of the clearing, hands clenched at her sides, taking in the small group of Apache warriors gathered around her. Dakota stood beside her, silent and imposing, but his presence was comforting, a steady anchor against the storm of fear and anger swirling in her chest. She had learned much about their ways in the days she had lived among them: respect, honor, courage. And now, she would speak in the only language both worlds could understand: action. The hunters appeared first as shadows along the ridgeline, their voices rising in frustration. They demanded her return, their insults and threats echoing off the canyon walls. Elena stepped forward, the wooden staff she carried trembling slightly but held firmly. She raised her chin, meeting their eyes with unwavering determination. "I am not yours," she said, her voice ringing through the morning air. "I belong to no one but the man who has risked everything for me. I choose him, and I choose the life he offers. I choose love, courage, and truth over fear and control." A hush fell over both sides. The Apache warriors exchanged glances, their eyes acknowledging the power of her words. Even the hunters froze, stunned by the audacity of a girl they had once thought helpless. Dakota stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder, the gesture a protective acknowledgement of her choice. "She speaks what is true," he said, his voice deep commanding. "She chooses her own path, and I honor that path." Elena felt the weight of every whispered night, every shared moment of trust, every touch and glance that had brought them to this day. Her fear of judgment, of retribution, of failure, melted into a fierce, unshakable certainty. She had made her choice, and she would not retreat. The hunters hesitated, unsure how to respond to such resolve. They had expected compliance, resistance, maybe even confusion, but not this. One by one, they lowered their rifles, muttering to each other, shame and frustration flickering in their eyes. The realization settled over them that this was not a girl to be commanded or coerced. She had chosen freely, and no threat could undo that. Elena turned to Dakota fully, meeting his gaze with unflinching courage. The man who had once been a shadow in the barn, wounded and wary, now stood with her as an equal, a partner, a protector. She reached for the beaded cord he had quietly placed in her hands days before, the cord that symbolized union, trust, and commitment. With deliberate care, she tied it around her wrist, a visible sign to both sides of the bond they had forged. The Apache warriors nodded, some with solemn respect, others with quiet smiles. Dakota's eyes softened, pride and relief mingling with the deep, unspoken affection that had grown between them. Elena understood in that moment that her life had irrevocably changed. No longer a maid, no longer a shadow of a town's expectations. She was a woman who had claimed her own heart, her own destiny, and the love of a man who had fought for her, trusted her, and chosen her in return. The hunters retreated at last, leaving the canyon behind in silence, defeated not by violence but by courage and choice. Elena and Dakota remained standing together, side by side, bound not only by love but by the unbreakable decision to face the world as one. And in that golden morning light, Elena knew she had found something far more enduring than safety or approval. She had found freedom, belonging, and a love that would never be denied. The first light of dawn stretched over the canyon, spilling gold and amber across the cliffs and streams. Elena stirred under the blankets, warmth from the fire mingling with the gentle heat of Dakota's presence beside her. For the first time in her life, she woke not to duty or fear, but to a quiet certainty that the world vast, wild, and unpredictable was hers to inhabit fully. Alongside the man who had claimed her heart, Dakota rose first, moving with the same silent grace that had always both intimidated and reassured her. He knelt to stoke the fire, eyes lifting to meet hers with a look that needed no words. In those dark, steady eyes, Elena saw the entirety of their journey reflected: danger, trust, stolen moments, and a love that had grown in the shadows of fear. She stepped from the blankets and across the rough-hewn floor, brushing her hair back. The Apache warriors had gathered outside, their faces calm, respectful. They watched her not as a stranger, not as an outsider, but as someone who had been chosen and had chosen in return. In their culture, trust and courage were honored above all else, and Elena now understood what it meant to earn that honor. Dakota moved to her side, offering his hand. She took it without hesitation. The warmth of his fingers enveloped hers, a simple gesture that spoke of protection, partnership, and shared destiny. Around them, the canyon whispered with the rhythm of life, the flowing stream, the rustling trees, the distant cry of an eagle high above. For the first time since leaving Elkridge, Elena felt unshakably free. The world beyond the canyon towns, judgment, fear held no power over her anymore. She had faced it, chosen her path, and survived with her courage intact. And more than that, she had chosen a love that was wild, untamed, and utterly true. Dakota gestured toward the beaded cord resting on a carved stone table. Elena picked it up, the beads cool against her skin, and tied it securely around her wrist once more. It was a symbol, yes, but also a promise. A promise that they would face the coming days, the unknown, and the challenges together. Not as master and servant, not as stranger and captive, but as equals, bound by trust and the fierce intensity of love. The Apache warriors murmured their approval. Some offered quiet smiles, others simply inclined their heads. In that moment, Elena understood fully what it meant to belong, to be recognized, valued, and accepted not for what she had been, but for who she was and the choices she had made. Outside, the canyon seemed to exhale with them, the wind carrying away the remnants of fear and uncertainty. Elena turned to Dakota, her fingers still entwined with his. His eyes softened, a rare smile flickering across his lips. "You are mine," he said simply, the weight of the words grounding her. "And you are mine," she replied, voice steady, certain, and full of the quiet strength that had carried her through so many nights of fear, doubt, and uncertainty. They stood together, side by side, watching the sun rise fully over the canyon. No one could take this moment from them. No hunter, no town, no expectation could sever the bond they had forged in darkness, in danger, And in the quiet courage of their hearts, Elena drew a deep breath, feeling the crisp canyon air fill her lungs. The girl who had once been invisible, overlooked, and timid now walked proudly in the light, hand in hand with the man who had shown her that love was both a refuge and a force stronger than fear itself. In that morning, the world shifted for them both. They belonged to each other fully, no secrets, no shadows, no doubts. And as they stepped out into the canyon together, the first day of their shared life began, wild, untamed, and theirs alone.